find courage. In your omniscience we find wisdom. In your omnipresence we will never be alone. Amen. God said, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. Moses said, if your presence will not go, do not carry us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people, unless you go with us? Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. It's interesting that this passage isn't done on April 15th or around there. I don't know why it's not. It would help us understand what's going on with taxes and tax season. It helps us remember that everything that we have is God's, and this little tax that we have to pay is really nice for these things like roads, schools, things like that. But sometimes it's good that we have this during stewardship, because sometimes we forget what is God's and what is the state's, and what is it, and how do we combine the two? How do we reconcile those two things together? Last week we had a wonderful installation service, and my daughter and I drove home together after that amazing service. I thank everyone who was here for it. She asked me, Dad, are bishops kings? And I said, yes, they are kings. She said, because they wear a crown. I said, that is a crown. We call it a mitre, but it's like a crown. The reality is that sometimes we struggle to figure out and to wade through the different options that we have in a world full of kings. We think we've done away with that as Americans, but we haven't. So today we are going to look at what is it that we need to render to the emperor or to Caesar? What is it that we need to render to God? And how we make a difference in the world in which we live right now. So the denarius that Jesus took would have had the emperor's face on it. It would have had probably, now I'm going to forget which Caesar it is, but Augustus lasted a long time. Julius didn't last so long, right, because he was murdered. And then as the Roman Empire got in its twilight years, many of the Roman emperors started to usurp one another, and they began to kill one another. And they asked the question, every time, which emperor is on it, because that was the one, because it had to be the correct emperor for the denarius. So when Jesus says who's on that, they say the emperor, they're saying the right thing. Now the emperor isn't just like George Washington on our dollar. We'll get to that in a little bit. The emperor is there to sacrifice to you. He is the site where God has made known the powers to the world, who's in power, and where God is to be found. And for the Romans, it was with the Roman emperor. And so when Caesar came up and rose up, and the Roman Republic became a Roman Empire, they believed God had done a work in the world. And they had all their other gods too, Aphrodite and Zeus, Jupiter and Venus, and all the other Roman pantheon, and they would still sacrifice to them. But when they did those sacrifices, they would also light a candle to the emperor. They would also set something aside for the emperor and for the spirit, the world spirit that was behind that emperor. But within little places within the empire, people wouldn't do it. They resisted the call to sacrifice and to share in worship with that person who's the head of the state. And they were the Jews. And they were also this new community of Christians. And they resisted, not because they didn't want to give money or they didn't want to pay their taxes or some glorified, freedom fighters or anything like that. They resisted because there was one God. The God who said in Exodus showed favor to Moses and to the people. The God who led them out of slavery in Egypt, led them out of the wilderness wanderings and into the promised land. The God who has created everything. And isn't just the God who shows his power through the state. And they were persecuted because of And the way in which they reconciled it, to give to Caesar what was Caesar's, is that they saw it as paying for land. Is that they were renting this space out. And Caesar was too, and he was their landowners, and they were the ones who were going to rent the space out until God returned and everything was set. But they never believed that their money went to the state and their some sort of spiritual worship went to God. They believed everything belonged to God, and even Caesar would be held accountable for what he did in the world, just like each and every one of us. So when the fledgling Christian community began to say, Jesus is Lord, and nothing else, what was whispered in that silence is Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. And you remember Dennis Peters talking about the Nicene Creed, which pounded out exactly what we believe, kind of, and all of that stuff, right? The struggle is that took 325 years to do, because we were being persecuted and killed for that early time. We didn't have time to do theology. We didn't have time to think about what God was like. What we had time to do was to resist the Roman Empire and the way in which they were living. So when Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, he's talking about worship. He's saying, fling your money wherever you want it to go, but I want everything, even your lives. And we are those who have inherited that mindset, that worldview, 2,000 years later. 3,500 years since they were wandering in the wilderness. We have taken that mindset and that worldview and begun to live it out and to struggle with it in our day and age. We are not persecuted for being Christians in the same way that our ancestors were. We don't struggle with that. So what do we do with this passage? How do we acknowledge who's Caesar and who are we resisting? Well, we have to recognize that when Jesus is Lord, that person who is in power of our lives is not anymore. So who is that? Well, in the democracy in which we live, a representative government, everyone's there because we put them there. We empower them. So when we say Jesus is Lord, which is what we do every Sunday, we're saying we are not. Jesus is Lord and I am not. And that the proper response to all of this is to discern the undertaking that is in front of us. Is to discern what the work is that we have to do, to discern who it is that God has called and what it is that God has called us to do. But the real question is what do we do with our money, then? What do we do with the fact that we're part of a state? What do we do with all of that? Because we have to struggle with that too. Because our brothers and sisters in West Africa still, we have more in common with them than our atheist friends probably. And yet they struggle right now with this Ebola crisis that supposedly will double every 3 weeks and continue to go on until something happens. But because they have no infrastructure, it is incredibly difficult to tackle that and to help them. The earthquake in Haiti in 2009, all of that happened because there was very little infrastructure and how hard it was, and they're still rebuilding it. But natural disasters come and go, but the fact that their government was in such disarray is very difficult. So we go back and we ask the question, how do we live as Americans? Well, we look at our money. Dollar bill, right? On the front, you got George Washington, who resisted calling himself Majesty, resisted saying, "Oh, I'm not your Majesty, just call me Mr. President." On the back, it says, "In God we trust." You know what else is on the back? Anybody? I mean, we're a small group today, so.
Great seal.
The Great Seal. Yep. It's one. It's on the right. The other one is this strange pyramid. It has the word Enoes Queptis. You know what that means? He approves of our undertaking. It's an unfinished pyramid with the all-seeing eye at the top and a gap between the peak of that pyramid and the rest of the work that's been done. What it is God approves of the real struggle of what we're trying to do here. It's not great. It's not holy. It's not going to lead to our salvation. But what we're struggling to do is to create a place where everyone is free and where we're trying to represent one another and doing the best that we can. Trying to reconcile. We're trying to work through who we are and how we have failed as a people. We're trying to work through who we are going to be and how we live through the failures of the present to live into a future that we have for us. But the gap between that eye that represents God and ourselves will never be bridged. But the work is still there to be done. That's what we're about. And that's what we struggle with as a country, is to continue that work, that great work of reconciliation, freedom, and all of the things that we do. But the God that we trust in Christianity will be around long after America. But the DNA that we have set forth politically might continue just as the Roman Empire did, and create something more beautiful in the future as well. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, to God what is God's. Because God has called you